Many of you will remember the well-known politician, former minister in a coalition government and founder of his own party, Don Chip. Famous for keeping the bastards honest. I got to know Don Chip very well. He became a good friend of mine. And we had many really good discussions together. We would have lunches together, and he would regularly invite me to dinner parties at his home. And with my family, we would sit around a big table sprinkled with some of the leading politicians and corporate chief executive officers, folk in high public office, including the likes of Tony Abbott. We would have many conversations round that table. And at first, when I was first invited, I was expecting serious debate on the budget, on social policy, on political strategy, all this stuff. And I half wondered about the kids. My kids at the time would have been about, the two that were with me then would have been about 6 and 8 years old. And I was a bit worried about them because I thought they would be completely out of it. But Don completely changed that, because instead of sharing with all these top end of town people, he would most of all spend time with the children. And I remember early on when we were round the table and he looked at my 6 and 8-year-old and he said, now tell me some of the many things about your mother that you love so much. And Primrose, my daughter, and Wesley, my son, would list all these wonderful things about Joni, my partner. How patient she was, and loving and caring, how intelligent she was, the way in which she could answer their questions, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful homily on motherhood. And then he said, now tell me about your father. And Primrose just said, nah, he's just Dad. And it prompted me to realize how important it is to really spend some those wonderful maternal, even if you're dad, maternal moments with your children. And that, you see, I believe that was really refreshing to concentrate, first of all, on Mum. Because like the front cover of today's order of service depicts, it's really, really important to take every opportunity for women to come out of the shadows. Or should we say, not quite politically correct, but you know what I mean, ladies first. You see, we take so much for granted regarding the role of women. And it's been so easy to bury and to hide women in the shadows, particularly because men have been predominantly in charge and controlling that. So today, of all days, today is the day where we put mums and women first. Why? Why do we do that? Well, obviously, because women have been in the shadows far too long. We read some of those Bible stories together. Here's an example in the story in Matthew. And Jesus concludes that, you recall the words that I read, "This is the truth," he said. "Wherever the gospel is preached throughout the whole world, what she has done will be spoken of so that we will remember her." Well, have we remembered her? What's her name? We don't know. We remember the deed, but not the woman. And whilst Jesus is saying, "Remember this woman," the guys that actually wrote it down years later thought, well, yeah, we better write it down, but her name's not relevant. She's a mere woman. So here she is, central to this story. And Jesus says she should go down in history. But the writers lose her name in the shadows. Here's another one. Sadly, many examples. When in the Gospels, and here's from Mark chapter 6, verse 3, there is a list of Jesus' family. We are told of his brothers and sisters. We have their names. His brothers, James and Joseph and Judas and Simon. We know that they were leaders in the church. But it says James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, and his sisters. They don't get a name. Their names aren't listed. They're just sisters. And so it has been throughout history. I'm certain that there were women disciples. Of course there were. Mary Magdalene is obviously one of them, and a leading, very, very close disciple to Jesus. Women were the last disciples, not the men, the last disciples at the cross, and the first at the tomb. The historian and scholar Geoffrey Blainey maintains that women comprised by far the majority of the early Christian congregations. Yet an organization, the church, which were expressed by those congregations, they worshipped a male god. They called it father, king, shepherd, master. And so inevitably, there was this heavy concentration on the male operators and not the vital, I believe, world-changing women. So, first reason that we spend time looking at the role of women today is because they've been in the shadows too long. Secondly, because Jesus reached out to women and had an inclusive and equal stance. Even though the history was written by men with a patriarchal view of the world, this Jesus breaks through those shadows. Consider the woman at the well. We're told that she had suffered from serious bleeding for 12 years, and this meant, in Jewish law, imagine this, in Jewish law, that she was a total outcast. She was not allowed to touch anybody. Not allowed to touch anybody. Even if she drank from a cup, that very cup that she had used had to be thrown away and never used again. Just imagine that. She was considered just so unclean. Imagine the stress the anxiety, the pain that lady, God bless her, had lived with for all those years. And then she dared to touch Jesus. She wasn't allowed to touch anybody. And yet she reached out and she touched this rabbi, this great teacher, this person with all these crowds around him, all these followers. She wanted to touch him. Isn't touching so important to our lives? So important to our friendships and our relationships? Touching, handshaking, holding hands, caressing, loving, kissing. That's so important to us. The disciples were horrified. A woman, and an unclean woman at that, dared to touch the Rabbi Jesus. They would have then been prepared to severely punish her and make her pain even worse. And that wouldn't have been ordinary. That's what would have been expected. And at this wonderful moment, Jesus turns and is face to face with her. And at that moment, looking into her eyes, for Jesus, there was nobody else at that moment. It was her. This woman living in the shadows was the only person in the world for her, for Jesus. She was a poor, unimportant, suffering woman, an unclean outcast. Yet to Jesus, she was the most important person in the world, a human soul in need. Jesus breaking through the shadows. And here's another little story. It screams out at us something unique about Jesus. He opens up a conversation and asks to share a cup of water with a Samaritan. The Samaritan woman is completely forbidden in Jewish law to even speak to a rabbi. Even worse than being a Samaritan, she's a woman. Imagine that. Jewish law forbade a rabbi to greet a woman in public. A rabbi might not even speak to his own wife or daughter or sister in public. There was even, but this is, so stupid. There was even a bunch of rabbis who were called Pharisees, who were called the bruised and bleeding Pharisees. And they were called that because they shut their eyes whenever they saw a woman on the street. And in so doing, they then walked into the walls and houses and made themselves bleeding as a consequence. Crazy. For a rabbi to be seen in public talking to a woman was the end of his reputation. And Jesus spoke to this woman. And not only was she a woman, she was a Samaritan and a woman of dubious character. She brought her out of the shadows. And then there's a third story. The story of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. The punishment for which at the time was stoning. Note the stoning was only for the women. The men got away with it, absolutely, completely free. And it does take two to tango, let me tell you. The blokes got off scot-free, but the women were stoned. And so she comes to Jesus, caught in adultery. But for Jesus, no retribution, no laying on of guilt, but what amounted to the huge contradiction of Jewish law and practice. And the very, very clever, of course, the very clever words that he used, that he who has no sin cast the first stone. These, together with the stories that we read, are all revolutionary and table-turning moments. Jesus just accepting the equality of a woman in a hugely dominated male world. Why today do we concentrate on women? Well, thirdly, because they've always played a key role, even, dare I say it, a majority role in the life of the church. It's one of the best kept secrets in Christianity, that women have played an enormous influencing role in the church, and without them we would not have a church. Although much is left unsaid in many of the writings, but nevertheless, both Christian and secular writers attest many, many times to the significant involvement of women in the early growth of Christianity. We know that many women served as leaders of the early church movement that sprang up throughout the Roman Empire. This list includes women. There are just a list of names to us now: Priscilla and Chloe and Lydia and Apphia and Nymphia, and the mother of John Mark, and the woman who's just referred to in John's second epistle as the elect lady. In the 2nd century, Clement of Alexandria wrote that the apostles were accompanied on their missionary journeys by women who were not marriage partners. Again, notice, no names, just women who accompanied them. And then there was Junia, mentioned by Paul in Romans as, I quote, of very high note amongst the apostles. The Archbishop of Constantinople in the 3rd century, John Chrysostom, wrote, "Indeed, to be described as an apostle at all was a great thing, but to have the added description of high note is of great status." Paul also mentions Phoebe as a deacon of the church. He also uses the Greek word prastates, which means overseer or high rank, often used in the early church to describe someone who has the authority to preside over the Eucharist. Celsus, a man who was a 2nd century detractor and critic of Christianity, once wrote in a deliberately unkind and taunting way that the church consisted only of silly and stupid women. His contemporary bishop, Cyprian, acknowledged in his writings, Testimonia, I quote, that Christian maidens, I love being a term, the Christian maiden. Christian maidens were very numerous. And he goes on to say that it was very difficult to find Christian husbands for all of them. And these comments give us a picture of the church disproportionately populated by women. And there is also evidence that women were better biblical scholars than men, particularly in the study of Hebrew and Greek. The circle of women who studied with Jerome, a great biblical scholar and theologian of the 2nd century, he was the guy that translated the Bible into Latin. He talks about women in the early years of the church, showing so much scholarship that he thought nothing of referring some church elders to the woman, Marcella, for the resolution, he says, of a hermeneutical problem. And by the early 3rd century, Augustine could declare that Christian women were better educated in spiritual matters than many a philosopher. Throughout the whole of that early church period, women are seen in the shadows, but you need to look for them. And there are many, many more. Phoebe, the 4 daughters of Philip, Armia, Alce, the sisters of Crescens, Grapte, 2 slave women prosecuted by the Roman governor Pliny, Catherine of Alexandria, Hypatia, Mary of Cassaliba, Maris, Eulogius, Sibelius, Thecla. They go on. They're there. They're there, but we've forgotten about them. The list goes on, and we know bits about a few of them because they are recorded as martyrs or often referred to in secular writings. But think of all those names we don't know. Yes, we would have no church without those women of the early church. And so we come a bit nearer to our own time. Think of Mary MacKillop, who founded the Little Sisters of Joseph. And after smashing through the glass ceiling and creating innovative education and support for the poorest children and young people, she was excommunicated in 1871. Of course, she was eventually reinstated and in 2010 was canonized. One might say a little bit late for her to fully appreciate it. But think of all these other women. Catherine Helen Spence, who lived 1825 to 1910, writer, preacher, reformer, feminist. She was the first woman minister in the world when she was ordained into the Unitarian Church in the 1870s. She founded education and accommodation for orphaned, destitute, and delinquent children. She was a forerunner of kindergartens and secondary schooling for girls. She fought for electoral reform and ensured that South Australia, where she lived and worked, was the first jurisdiction in the world to allow women to stand for office. She continued to fight for women's suffrage, and she became a symbol of what women could achieve when she died in 1910 and was described as the grand old woman of Australia. Sensational. But do we remember her name much? No. We recall fumbling and very silly men like Burke and Wills, but amazing women like Catherine Spence are left in the shadows. So, right men, be prepared for this. Let's identify some of the key roles that women can continue to play and honor them. Here's a list of categories, fully researched and verified by university departments throughout the world. Firstly, women are better students than men, particularly in maths and science and computer coding. They pick up things more quickly, which then enables them to be better at imparting that knowledge, that is, teaching. I know that women, again in the background against all the odds, have demonstrated wonderful, wonderful teaching results. Here is Susanna Wesley. This woman, although she never preached a sermon, published a book, or founded a church, is known as the mother of Methodism. Why? Because Susanna, herself the 25th child of 25 children, can you imagine that? She had 19 children, and she taught all of them who survived, male and female, 6 hours a day, including classical studies, Latin, Greek, and music. And from them emerged, of course, John and Charles Wesley, who between them changed the church worldwide. Countless women took up these roles and quietly but very impressively have left us these legacies, teaching. And then there are women like Hildegard of Bergen, St. Teresa of Avia, Mary Wollstonecraft, Jane Austen, Sojourner Truth. Look up her. She was a slave in the south of the United States of America who was a slave, fought for black women's rights. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin and a great leader in the Congregational Church. The list goes on. They are all great reformers and educationalists. Women are great teachers. As it's Mother's Day, forgive me for sharing this very, very close and personal experience of my own. I want to talk for a few minutes about my mum. She met my dad when he was in his early to mid-20s. And my dad had been brought up in a real tough part of England. He was thrown out of home when he was 12 to go and, at 12, you're old enough to look after yourself now, son. And he went out into the world. He couldn't read or write. He was totally illiterate. And I'll talk about my dad on Father's Day, but he met my mum. And the one thing that he wanted to do was to be a policeman. He had all sorts of jobs for the first 10 years or so of his young life. But he could never be a policeman because he could never pass the entrance exam. He couldn't read or write. And my mum took it upon herself to teach him. And she taught him to read and write and gave him, a bit like Susanna Wesley, a complete course, which enabled him to pass the police entrance exam. And he retired as chief commissioner. And it was all because of that grounding in education. When he first met my mother, she was the teacher, as indeed she was for me too. Women are great teachers. Women are also, let me say, better listeners. That's why the listening professions of counseling psychology and organizations like Lifeline are dominated by women. And this leads on to consider that women are much better within what might be called the caring professions. For the whole of my ministry, I've worked predominantly for the not-for-profit sector in the caring and social sector. I've worked as a senior executive and chief executive officer in a number of not-for-profits, both in Australia and in the UK. And whilst I was the boss of all those organizations, in every single case, women were by far the majority. And that organization that I recently concluded, Melbourne City Mission, 80% of the caring staff of that organization are women. I could be here all day just recalling all those things that actually women are better at than men. Multitasking, driving, empathizing, tolerating pain, handling stress, and consistently across the world outstrip men in IQ testing. And listen to this, fellas. The International Journal of Business, Governance and Ethics recently published research that concluded that female-led companies are more successful than those led by men. It's true. We have, as a church and as a gender, we have much to learn from our women friends, colleagues, and partners. It was one Mother's Day, I decided, my presents for my wife have always been a disaster. She says to me, the best present I have ever given her on any occasion was the receipt. Because it always goes back. But I thought on this occasion, on this particular Mother's Day, I thought I'd get it right. I did a bit of research and I discovered a particular book that I'm pretty sure that she would love. I did the reviews. It was a fabulous review. It was selling well. And I bought this big book. It was 1,200 pages. And I wrapped it up. And I gave it to her. And I said, I think you'll like this, I said. The reviews are excellent. And I think I might have heard you mention it sometime. And she said, oh, yes, she did. I've been lying next to you in bed for the last 3 months reading it. I had the receipt. And so, as we honor women today, we are reminded that they've got much to teach us. And may, as a church, we become, like women, a teaching church, a church that listens, a church that cares, a church that has empathy, a church that multitasks because we've got so many different things to do. Today, we honor women and mums everywhere. We take time to consider the wonderful women of the past, of the present, and of the future. We think of our mums, our sisters, our aunts, our grannies, our daughters, our teachers, our mentors, our carers, our colleagues, and our friends. Those who in many different ways have influenced our lives. And today, we give thanks for them. And we pray that we learn from them. And so we go with joy, praising mothers and women who have touched our lives, our church, our community, our world. Let's go with the Spirit to care, to teach, to give. Let our hearts pour out maternal love as we touch those around us. Love divine or love's excelling.